my next question to be about Lafayette. And so I thought I would read a couple of Facebook posts that certain students who are critical of you read in the lead up to this event and just ask you to respond to them.
Okay.
So this is a student writing, Lafayette College, I am utterly disappointed that you're allowing this to take place on our campus. I thought we went through this last semester with Roaming Millennial. Inviting hateful speakers who make wildly unsubstantiated claims is not going to fly with the student body. I get it. The Mill Series events are private and not endorsed by the college, but you absolutely have the power to make a statement on this. The fact that you're not is an embarrassment to our community. If you believe this man is a legitimate source of knowledge because he has a degree in clinical psychology, feel free to ask our psychology department faculty and counseling center staff about the validity of his claims. I'm certain they would not endorse this speaker. Do better, in all caps. For those of you unfamiliar, Jordan Peterson is known for denouncing the Me Too movement, claiming that women are in no way marginalized in the West, arguing against the existence of gender-neutral pronouns, arguing against gun control in the U.S., and claiming that identity politics and social justice movements are part of a devious Marxist agenda. And then another student responded, and this is briefer. College conservatives know that if they bring in a speaker who is willing to blatantly insult a portion of the audience, and the libs get angry enough about this for good reason, then they may get an op-ed written about them in the New York Times. As a result, there are a whole group of hacks, like Milo and Peterson, who get famous and invited purely for their promise to misgender trans students and advocate provocative but ultimately toothless arguments about social Darwinist race theory. What I'm saying is that you have every right to be pissed. Jordan Peterson is a harmful moron, but know that you being pissed is also 100% of the point of why he was invited. He's not a conservative. He's just a guy who's mildly racist enough to offend college liberals and therefore secure wins for the cultural right.
Comparatively mild stuff. It's the chattering buzz of ideologically possessed demons. So there's nothing in it that's not entirely predictable. That's one of the things you notice when you're talking to people. If you want to find out whether the person is there or the ideology is there, you listen to see if you're hearing anything that someone else of the same ideological mindset couldn't have told you. You know, like I've had thousands of conversations with people because I've spent 20 years as a clinical psychologist. And one of the things I've learned about people is that they're unbelievably interesting. If you get someone to sit down and you move past the superficial, which you can actually do quite rapidly, they'll tell you all sorts of things that only they know, that are unbelievably enlightening about their own peculiar problems, about the way they look at the world, about their idiosyncratic familial dynamics, like just fascinating personal stuff. It's the stuff of great novels, you know, and this is ordinary people. I don't really think there is an ordinary person exactly. There's the facade of ordinariness, but behind that, people are very rarely ordinary. And so the conversations are almost instantaneously fascinating. And one of the guidelines that I used in my clinical practice constantly was, like, I had this sense, I probably learned this mostly from Carl Rogers, was that if the conversation wasn't really interesting, then we weren't doing anything that was therapeutically useful. But all of the interesting elements of it were very, very personal. And so to replace this, and I learned this mostly from Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his detailed analysis of what I would call ideological possession, he talked about people he met in the Gulag camps who were under the sway of rigid communist orthodoxy, and noted very clearly that it was like there was a crank in some sense on the side of their head, and you could just crank the crank and out would come the ideological dogma, and it's all entirely predictable. And people who are in a situation like that don't understand that they're possessed by an idea, right? Carl Jung said people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And it's like, so there's nothing in that that's anything other than exactly what you would predict. And then there's a deeper issue too, and this is one that I think has bedeviled me ever since I made my initial videos, which is it's impossible for those on the radical left to admit that anyone who opposes what they're doing might be reasonable, because what that would mean would be that you could be reasonable and oppose the radical left, and that would imply that what the radical left was doing wasn't reasonable. And so instead of dealing with the fact that I actually happen to be quite reasonable, the attempt is to assume that anyone who objects must be part of the radical right. It's like, well, actually, no. There's lots of space between the radical left and the radical right. There's the moderate, reasonable left, for example, and then there's the center, and then there's the moderate, reasonable right, and then there's the far right, and then there's the extreme right. All of that exists in opposition to the radical left, but it's very convenient for the radicals on the left to say, oh, well, you don't buy our doctrine, and then to immediately make the presupposition that you must be the most heinous example of that entire array of potential. I thought we were talking about masculinity.
We are.
No, we're not.
Yes, we are.
How are we talking about masculinity?
Because I'm asking you what you think of men and of women.
Basically what you've been trying to do, I would say, for the last 15 minutes is put me into a sequence of corners by accusing me of various forms of misbehavior.
According to you, what is a real man, or what should he be?
You should want the best for people, for you, for your family, and for the community. Courage is a good thing. Courage in the face of life's difficulties. One of the things I suggest to the people who are watching my videos, for example, is that a good ambition is to be the most reliable person at your father's funeral.
You think that nowadays men lack virility, that they're not men anymore?
No, I think that you could make a case that they are punished for those virtues and so are less likely to feel confident in their expression or development.
You feel that society nowadays tells men that it's not okay to be ambitious?
I think it's definitely the case that happens. It's certainly not encouraged, it's discouraged because of the confusion between, the purposeful confusion, in my estimation, between power and competence.
You think the hierarchy of the patriarchal system is a good one?
Well, first of all, I'm not convinced that the theory that what we have is a patriarchal hierarchy is correct to begin with. I don't think that way, because I don't understand precisely what that means. Does that mean that women had no role in shaping our society? It's only been the last 10 years that people have made the presumption that it's self-evident that what we live in is a patriarchy. What women haven't contributed? Is this the point we're making? Is that women haven't contributed to our society? They just weren't there until, 1965. And all of a sudden they took their place. All the women before that weren't doing anything at all. It was all patriarchy.
You don't feel that globally men have the better end of the stick?
No. No, I don't believe that globally men have the better end of the stick. Like what? I don't understand why people would even begin to conceptualize the world that way. Better in what way?
Roles of power in businesses, politically, men pretty much rule the world, no?
Well, what about in warfare? What about in dangerous jobs? Who gets killed in war? Who fights in war? Men.
You have women who are soldiers in the army nowadays. Yeah. It's opening more and more.
Yeah. Well, no, we're not going to go down that.
Is a woman soldier not as good as a man soldier?
I don't know whether a woman soldier is as good as a man soldier. I know that in most armed forces, women aren't placed in high combat frontline positions.
Who is responsible for this, the demasculization of the society?
Feminist groups have a fair bit to do with it, and the radical left types that insist that what we live in is a patriarchal tyranny.
What is the issue with feminists nowadays?
They think that the idea that our culture is a tyrannical patriarchy is an axiomatic truth. Well, I think that's complete nonsense. The insistence that sex, gender identity, and gender expression are social constructions, the insistence upon that, the insistence that if there are any differences in outcome, that's a consequence of oppression. That's what's up with them. All of that's complete bloody nonsense.
You have the feeling that feminism has gone too far?
Far too far. But it's the leftist it's not so much feminism, it's really the the ideology that characterizes the radical left. Feminism is part of that.
Even though there were still huge inequalities.
What inequalities are we talking about precisely?
Talking about wages, access
The
to
wage
positions
gap
of
has
power.
nothing to do. The wage gap has nothing to do with prejudice, or virtually nothing to do with it. Single men and women in their 20s. In fact, there's a wage advantage for single women in their 20s. So if there's any gap at all with regards to wages, it's a gap between people and mothers.
Most of the data in all of the countries, come up to that conclusion that a woman who has the same position as a man.
Women and men who do the same job, the women end up getting paid less?
Yes.
And you control for everything else? No, sorry, the data's wrong. There's at least 16 reasons why men get paid more than women. Men work longer hours. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Okay, men work in more dangerous positions. So there's a wage advantage for working in more dangerous positions. Men are more likely to move as a consequence of being required to by their job. So men are, there's more.
I understand what you're saying. You're saying that there were many different points that explain why we come up to that final statistic, but that if you look at the reasons why, then it's because men work longer, because they move more than women, and they
work in more dangerous positions. They're more likely to work outside.
I'll take you on that.
They're more likely to work in STEM fields. They're more likely to work in fields where you can scale. If you look and you say, well, on average, women make less money than men, which is also different than saying that they make less for doing the same work, because those aren't the same claims, then you have to say, well, what are the reasons that are contributing to that? You can't just say, well, it's a consequence of gender discrimination, unless you can only think about one thing at a time. And I would say that's another problem with the modern feminists, is they can only think about one thing at a time.